are many brave men in this southern land who have hurried away to the field, who have sworn to defend us or die in the cause ere our independence they'll yield. I hear their war cry sounding, sounding deep over mountain and glen. Their lights bringing footsteps are trampling the hill. 'Tis the march of the southern men, 'tis the march, 'tis the march, 'tis the march of the southern men. How bravely they move under fire, though they know their kindred they ne'er may see more, and cheerfully follow their chief to the field where they gathered their laurels before. I hear their war cry sounding, sounding deep over mountain and glen. Behold, their battalions are charging again. 'Tis the march of the southern men, 'tis the march, 'tis the march, 'tis the march of the southern men. God's blessing be with them will still be the prayer of every patriot's heart, and to them may victory always be given, and ne'er from their banners depart. I hear their war cry sounding, sounding deep over mountain and glen. Their bright gleaming banners have carried the hill. 'Tis the march of the southern men, 'tis the march, 'tis the march, 'tis the march of the southern men.
May 12th, 1997. This is an Ann Arbor Civil War Roundtable program with Dr. Ian Pemberton from the University of Windsor, speaking on how the South might have won the Civil War. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome our friend from across the river, Dr. Ian Pemberton.
Thank you, Tom. Before I start, I should perhaps just give you a slight caveat. I've been fighting an upper respiratory infection for the last 10 days. I'm on antibiotics, and I'm not really 100%. So I hope that my performance doesn't suffer too much as a result. And I apologize in advance for any deficiencies that may appear. My approach tonight is going to be to look primarily at three novels, all of which are based on the proposition that the Confederacy won the Civil War and what happens as a result. The books are entitled Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore, which was published, I think, in the early 1950s. My very mothy copy dates from 1953, and I think I read it as an undergraduate in university. A More Perfect Union by Robert Stapp. This came out in 1971, is also a bit dog-eared, as you can see. And finally, in much better condition, Robert Skimmons' Grey Victory, which appeared in 1989, relatively recent times. Three very different approaches, very different books. They all evolve on from three very different positions as to how and why the Confederacy was able to establish its independence. And of course, being novels, they use that premise as the basis of a story. Let me read you the teaser from the first one I want to look at, Wardmore's Bring the Jubilee. In this unusual novel, you will live for a few hours in an America strangely like and curiously unlike the one we know. For, in this book at least, the South has won the Civil War. The consequences of that victory for both North and South are related in a novel as surprising as it is convincing. You may want to question that last. Whether you live above or below the Mason-Dixon line, this is a book that will delight and stimulate you with one of history's most challenging ifs. For here is a world that might very well have been. It all depended on a certain day in July 1863, which perhaps gives you a broad hint as to the crucial event in this particular story. The book begins in the year 1938, 74 years after the end of the War for Southern Independence, which ended in 1864 with Confederate victory. It begins on a small farm in upstate New York near Schenectady, where a hard-scrabble farmer and his wife and their 17-year-old son are trying desperately to make a living for themselves. Their struggle is representative of the United States of America in the aftermath of the defeat by the Confederacy. The United States in 1938 and in the years that follow, up to the early 1950s, is a badly run, wretched, economically depressed, culturally deprived, unpleasant country. You wouldn't want to live there. You wouldn't want to visit. It is a country in which most of the people are either sharecroppers or indentured laborers, two familiar phrases from American history, two familiar states of being. To be a freeman in the United States of America in this book does not necessarily refer to color. It refers to one's economic status. It refers to one's ability, however fragile it may be, to function outside those other two classes. There is, of course, an upper class, the old landed aristocrats and people of money before the Civil War who've managed to survive. But for most people, life is a very hard scrabble indeed. Now, the United States at this time did extend to the Pacific, just barely. However, no transcontinental railway had been built yet, mainly because the Indians still occupied the plains. They had not been subdued. The Sioux, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and so forth had never been defeated, and therefore the line of western settlement stopped about Iowa and picked up again in Oregon, and in between the Indians ruled still. There were few railroads in the country, very few paved roads. Stagecoaches were still common, often held up by bandits. Travel was difficult, sometimes almost impossible. The American people themselves were predictably an unattractive people. Most of them were just simply trying to survive and doing whatever was necessary. There was no cultural life to speak of. We do not hear of any great writers in this period. The Walt Whitmans, the Carl Sandburgs, the Mark Twains may have been somewhere, but they do not appear in this particular story. Life is a hard struggle indeed. In contrast, the South is a magnificent success story. Shortly after the war, in the early 1870s, the South ended slavery, partly because of world opinion, partly because many Southerners could see that the system was essentially counterproductive over the long haul. They opened their doors to the teeming immigrants from Europe, who, of course, might otherwise have gone north. They developed a great variety of industries. Quite on what basis this was, the book is silent. Was this a sort of justification of the thesis that cotton is indeed king? Perhaps, but it's not clear in this. However, they had built 7 transcontinental railways to the Pacific coast, and of course they had California. British America, in brackets Canada, modestly had 1 transcontinental railway, which was 1 more than the United States had. The South had also managed to conquer not only the whole of what is today the American Southwest, take it over, but had also taken over almost all of the rest of the hemisphere, Mexico, Central America, and all of South America. I'm not sure about Cuba, but certainly the mainland had all been absorbed by the Confederacy. Mexico City had been renamed Leesburg, and one of the leading Confederate institutes of higher education was the University of Lima in Lima, Peru, however unlikely that might seem. Southerners were wealthy, by and large. I should preface that to say the upper class of white Southerners was wealthy. Lower class white Southerners and former slaves did not share in this largesse. But to be an upper class white Southerner was to have the world by the tail. The Confederacy was one of the great international powers, along with the British Empire, with whom it was loosely aligned, against the German Union and the Spanish Empire. Now, quite how, a Confederate mishap at Gettysburg could have changed European history is not made clear, and is perhaps one of my questions here. But at any rate, that was the sort of international alignment. None of them regarded the United States with any respect. There was no international respect for the United States, which was regarded as a kind of northern banana republic, unable to police its own land, unable to pay its debts, and so forth. A very wretched situation indeed. Into this unhappy world is born the hero of this book, whose name is Hodgins Bachmaker. Hodge, we'll call him. His friends call him Hodge. Hodge left home at the age of 17, which was probably a good idea because certainly the farm was going nowhere, and his mother was an absolute Puritan Tartar. In fact, the women in this book are really quite something. You wouldn't want to meet any of them in a dark alley. They're quite remarkable creatures, starting with Hodge's mother, who I suppose it should be said did manage to keep the family together, but she was a very, how shall I say it, the sort of Puritan ideal run to its illogical conclusion. Anyway, Hodge leaves and he walks to New York City because there's no other way to get there. And takes him several days. He finally arrives and he eventually ends up working for a printer, a guy who prints books. And Hodge himself is a frustrated intellectual. He wants to be a historian of all things. And so working for a printer who has access to books is not a bad thing for him. And in his spare time, he does a good deal of reading. Now, the printer is a kind of sardonic fellow. He's a freeman, but he's struggling to make a living, and just barely getting by. He doesn't pay Hodge anything in the 8 years Hodge works for him. Hodge is allowed to sleep under the workbench, and he's fed once a day with a massive meal of bread and beef heart that is cooked over a fire until it's sort of more or less edible. And this is how he lives, you see, and he works printing and putting books together, and also reading furiously, and he's determined he's going to become a historian. He has one unhappy romance with a rather extraordinary young woman in New York who is herself an indentured servant, and who makes it very clear that her only goal in life is to escape this class by marrying a wealthy freeman. Hodge doesn't fit that description, but she allows him to have her way with him in a manner of speaking, but shows absolutely no passion and creates the most bizarre picture. You can imagine the two of them together there with this young woman behaving as if, she was scratching a mosquito bite or something. Well, poor Hodge is, as it were, doing his best. Needless to say, it's an affair bound to fail. But it's rather typical of his life in New York. New York is a city of about 1 million people at this time, and even more if you include the suburb of Brooklyn across the river. But it's an unattractive place, to put it mildly, a very unattractive place. If you've read descriptions of New York during the draft riot in 1863 of the working class districts and so forth, that was kind of what it was like in Hodge's time in the 1930s and late 1930s and 1940s while he was working there. Hodge's boss tells him that he should forget this ambition to become a historian. You'll never be a historian, he said. You don't have enough gumption. You're basically passive. You're an observer. You're an observer of society. And he puts him down constantly and makes his life miserable, and Hodge can't wait to get away. And he finally, after about 8 years of this, he starts writing to various American universities. Now, American universities, of course, as you can imagine, they were not exactly desirable places of higher learning. If you had any gumption at all, you went to the Confederacy or maybe to Britain. You certainly didn't go to an American university. But he had no money, so he had to do what he had to do. So he writes to these various places. Of course, gets no answers. Then one answer does come from a Professor Huggerswell, who has an institution in York, Pennsylvania. And the good professor says, don't accept any other offers until you've talked to our representative. Well, the representative shows up at the printing shop one day, and this is Huggerswell's daughter, Barbara, and she is another of the extraordinary women who populate this book. Barbara is brilliant. She's a physicist. She's, I gather, a handsome woman would be one way of looking at it. Very ebullient. She is extremely enthusiastic about her father's institution in York, and she's not quite sure that Hodge is really up to it. But the long and short of it is that he goes there, and he eventually becomes her lover. Unfortunately, so is every other man in the place. And Barbara takes the view that there's no, this is the way things should be, and that every man is sort of her field of conquest. And but none of her various lovers are ever to look at another woman, or she gets very annoyed indeed. And there is a little bit of a problem because there is another woman involved with whom Hodge eventually marries and so forth. So he has a very hard time about that, but we won't get into that. In the meantime, Hodge is taken on by this institution as a historian. He's the only historian in the place. And his interest is the last days of the War of Southern Independence, which is so central to his life and to the life of the country. And he develops the thesis that the beginning of the end was Chancellorsville. That up to Chancellorsville, the Union wasn't perhaps winning, but it wasn't actually losing either. It was sort of, back and forth. However, Chancellorsville was, of course, a great disaster. Hooker's miscalculations, Stonewall Jackson's famous flanking march, that happened in our time, and that happened in his time as well. So the defeat at Chancellorsville is where the wheels start to come off. Because what happened after that was Lee invaded Pennsylvania. And what happened there was that on the afternoon of the 1st of July, 1863, the armies were converging, as we know, on Gettysburg. And on the morning of the 2nd of July, the Army of the Potomac, Meade's army, found itself on Cemetery Ridge, with the Confederates attacking them at the north end of the ridge, at Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, but also the Round Tops at the southern end of the ridge, occupied by Confederate troops, with artillery firing straight down a Cemetery Ridge. If any of you have been to Gettysburg, you can perhaps sort of imagine that in your own mind. Confederates to the north of them, Confederates to the south of them, banging away at them. By the end of the second day at Gettysburg, Meade's army was in pretty perilous condition. One might argue that perhaps they should have retreated during the night, but for whatever reason they didn't. And on the third day, General Lee struck the coup de grace, the Pickett's famous charge. 15,000 as yet unused infantrymen from Longstreet's division were driven right into the middle of this disorganized mass of Union troops, smashed through Hancock's corps, cut the Army of the Potomac in half. Most of them surrendered, but those that didn't managed to escape from the field, and they fled in a northeasterly direction towards York. At one point, when Hodge is traveling this country, he finds monuments, that here such and such a division tried to make a stand, here such and such a regiment was wiped out, here Jeb Stuart's cavalry attacked such and such a group, and so forth, as they fled north. The remnants of the Army of the Potomac finally gathered for a defense at Philadelphia. Washington was abandoned, Baltimore was abandoned. The Lincoln government fell back on Philadelphia, called in reinforcements from the northeast, Pennsylvania militia, and made a desperate stand to hold Philadelphia as Lee's army regathered and pushed towards that major center. One possibility was a counterstroke in Tennessee. And to that end, the Union armies in the West were ordered to launch an attack on the Confederate stronghold at Chattanooga and wrestle it from the control of Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. They failed miserably. The attack on Chattanooga was a total disaster. Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, by God, names that would ring forever in northern ears as synonyms of disaster, as the armies of Grant and Rosecrans, Thomas, and so forth were just routed. So there was no relief from that quarter. And on July the 4th, 1864, the Army of the Potomac officially surrendered at Reading, Pennsylvania, and the war was over. The Confederacy generously gave back the Appalachian Mountain area to the Union because, of course, there was a good deal of pro-Union sentiment in that area, as you know. So the border, in effect, sort of ran along the northern border of Maryland, then cut down through the Appalachians, giving West Virginia, eastern Tennessee, eastern Kentucky to the Union, and then cut through right across the middle of Kentucky, giving northern Kentucky to the Union, but including Missouri and all the rest of the Southwest inside southern borders. Now, Hodge was studying all this and writing on it, and he finally produced a massive tome called Chancellorsville and After, which became was quite well reviewed in a number of leading Confederate journals, which is where you want it to be well reviewed, of course, in this context. And he was gratified by this, but he got a letter from a Confederate professor with the delightful name of Jefferson Davis Polk, who said, enjoyed your book, but you've mishandled Gettysburg. Your description of Gettysburg is not accurate. You do not give enough credit to our great General Robert E. Lee, and you attribute too much to the element of chance in our victory at Gettysburg. I do believe, sir, you should take a second look. Well, Hodge is, of course, very upset about this. He studied all the sources. He doesn't really know where else to go. And he occasionally wanders into the study of the institute at Hugger's Haven, as it's called, near York. And he talks to the portrait of the founder of this institution on the wall, a very fine-looking gentleman with a flowing red beard and so forth, who was Barbara Huggerswell's great-great-grandfather, and actually a former Southerner who'd come north after the war and had established this place and converted to become a Yankee. And so Barbara, in the meantime, who, as I say, was erratic but brilliant, has developed a time machine, don't they all, eh? A time machine, how wonderful. And so they all start flitting around in time, you see, and they go back to 1820 and see people working in the fields and so forth. And Hodge sees this as the answer. He will go back to Gettysburg. So he goes back. I see your question, but we'll get to it in a minute. Okay, he goes back, and he arrives on the midnight of the 30th of June, and he starts walking down the York Pike towards Gettysburg. And of course, he runs quickly into evidence of the converging armies on Gettysburg. And he walks through Gettysburg, which is filled with Union troops at this point. And by the early afternoon of the 1st of July, he is south of Gettysburg. He's on the Emmetsburg Turnpike. And he notices on his left a peach orchard. By this time, he's walked quite a long way. It's a hot day, and he's tired, so he sits down and he eats a little of the grub that he's brought with him. He's dressed in a sort of black outfit that he hopes will let him blend in fairly well. And while he's sitting there, Union troops come up the road, come up the Emmetsburg Pike from the south, and they're in retreat, and they're in bad shape, and a number of them have lost their rifles, and they don't have their hats, and they look beaten. You know, they just look very beaten. And they stagger on by, they're dragging their guns in the dust, and they're fighting among themselves and so forth. They don't look like a very reputable lot. And about half an hour later, he's still sitting there when a group of Confederates come up. And they too are no screaming hell, but they have a sort of swagger about them. They are victorious. They've been pushing these Yankees ahead of them. And one of them spots Hodge sitting by the side of the road and goes over and he says, so I like your boots. I think we'll just trade your boots for my boots, because my boots are in worse shape than yours. And Hodge at this point realizes he's made a tremendous error, because he's not supposed to interfere in any way with what's going on. He's supposed to keep back and be the observer. Anyway, an officer comes up and wants to know what's going on, you see, and this Confederate private says, well, I want this fellow's boots. The officer says, well, you can't do that. You know, we have orders from General Lee. We're not to loot civilians. You know, we take government stores, yes, but we're not to we're to leave individual civilians. Well, I want this bow's boots. Well, you're not going to have his boots. And they start arguing. They start fighting. And a pistol comes out, you see, and they rock back and forth. The shot fires, and this officer, this captain, is killed. And most shot goes right through the bottom of his head and blows the top of his head off. And the Confederate troops sort of stand back aghast at this, and then they just sort of disperse. They stop their line of pursuit, and they just sort of disappear. They break up. So Hodge goes forward, and he looks at this fellow, and he says, my God, that face is familiar. I've seen this man before now, but he's only a captain. Now, maybe he was supposed to, maybe I saw him a picture at the end of the war, but that can't be. He's dead. He's dead. And he looks very familiar. He looks very familiar. And anyway, he continues to hide out, and he watches the battle unfold. And what horrifies him is that the battle that unfolds is totally different from the battle that he has read about. It's completely different. On the 2nd, it is Union troops who eventually realize that the Little Round Top in particular is uncovered. Gouverneur Warren and Joshua Chamberlain and those fellows, and do their heroic bit just in time to stop Hood's men as they're coming up the other side. And the line holds. There's vicious fighting in the peach orchard and the wheat field, which he said, this never happened. He's studied all the documents. He can't believe it. Then on the 3rd, of course, Pickett's charge is a total disaster. It's half the men are killed and they're beaten back, and it's the Confederates who retreat. So he's very puzzled about this, but he makes his way back to the barn near York, where he's to be taken back to 1952, I think it is now, and he's there at the appointed time, and nothing happens. He's not taken back. He wakes up the next morning, and he's still in 1863. And then it suddenly occurs to him, the officer who was killed, he'd seen him before. That was the founder of Huggersville. That was the guy who'd founded Huggersville. And his orders had been to occupy the Little Round Top. And had he done that, the Confederates would have probably won the battle. So poor old Hodge suddenly realizes he's changed history, and he's writing all this in 1877, and he says, I'm now 45 years old. I'm convinced I will die before 1921, which is the date I was born originally. And the book ends with the discovery of an old manuscript written by this crazy old farmhand who'd worked for years on this farm near York, Pennsylvania, and who claimed that he'd come from another age and so forth, and who had finally died at whatever time it was. That's basically the plot of the book. Now, the most serious problem I have with this, and some of you, I'm sure many of you would share this view, is that if you're familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, the encounter that he describes here did never take place. There were no Union troops coming up the Emmitsburg Road in defeat on the afternoon of July the 1st. There were no Confederate troops coming up that road to move in on the Little Round Top. The Confederate troops, as you know, were mostly north and northeast of Gettysburg during those early times of the battle. And Union troops were moving in from, well, basically the southeast. So the incident on which the Battle of Gettysburg theoretically turns, you see, I would argue, could never really have happened. Now, you perhaps have to know a little bit about the battle to be able to make that judgment for the uneducated reader or the general reader. That perhaps would be a forgivable slip. The other thing that I find a little hard to deal with is, why is the Union such a wretched place? Even if the Confederacy had won, which is certainly a possibility, I cannot conceive that the Union would have degenerated in 75 years into some sort of third-rate northern banana republic. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's the sort of lost cause turned on its head. And it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. I'm sorry, there was a question here.
That's all right.
Yeah, okay. Let me press on. I've spent probably too much time on Jubilee. A more perfect union. Let me read the teaser on the back here. Now, don't take offense. This is what it says. God damn Abraham Lincoln! If he'd had the guts of a goat, he'd have settled this thing once and for all. It is 1981. The Confederacy, allowed to live on by Lincoln's refusal to suppress it, now threatens a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States. Howie Ray Spearman, don't you love the name? Howie Ray Spearman, President of the Confederacy, has prepared his totalitarian social apparatus for this very purpose. Only the assassination of Spearman can prevent a disaster. Combining moral courage with political expediency, the United States responds to the challenge. Cordell Vance, military genius with a dishonorable discharge, is sent to rid the world of Spearman. But Vance is a Southerner by birth. Can he do it? Well, of course he can. If he doesn't, there's no plot. So, you know. Now, you're right. For Civil War buffs, there's one key section of this book, around page 100, where we finally get into the historical background of the decision that, in effect, allowed the Confederacy to establish its independence. You all know that there was some division of opinion anyway in those early months of 1861. One thinks of Horace Greeley's famous headline in the Tribune, the erring sisters go in peace, that kind of thing. Southerners were fond of saying that they would wipe up with their handkerchief all the blood that would be spilled in any war that would result from secession, and so forth and so on. The key passage is a cabinet meeting of the Lincoln government, probably about the 7th or 8th of April, 1861. They have received word from the commander at Fort Sumter, Major Anderson, that he is running dangerously low on supplies. He cannot hold out for more than a few more days. He either has to be reinforced or he will have to surrender. And the question is what to do. Do we give up the fort, or do we reinforce it and in effect put the ball back in the Confederacy's court? In the reality, you know what the decision was. In this version, it's not quite so clear. The cabinet is very divided and is debating the issue. And William Henry Seward urges that perhaps the best thing to do is simply to surrender Fort Sumter, that to try and reinforce it would be seen as a gesture, a defiant gesture by the very sensitive South, and that there was a good deal of pro-Union sentiment in the South, and particularly in the border states. And if we show restraint on Sumter, it will hold the border states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and so forth. The other side is argued vigorously by the Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, who says, no, we cannot do this. You know, this is an insult to the flag, a national insult. If we let Sumter go, the whole South will go. The Upper South will interpret this as a symbol of weakness, and this will be the signal for them to go. Lincoln listens to both sides, and then finally, with a mournful expression, and as you know, nobody could do mournful better than Old Abe at the best of times. And well, he said, I feel in the final analysis that Mr. Seward is right. And a number of other Simon Camerons going, yeah. Doesn't like the idea of the army getting involved in this. And even old Gideon Wells is a reluctant convert, but he goes along with it. And anyway, Lincoln makes the final decision, and he polls the cabinet, and of course they all agree, even Montgomery Blair and Salmon P. Chase, who had originally been very much against it. So instead of reinforcing Sumter, the garrison is withdrawn, and the Confederates take Sumter without a shot being fired. So the key here is not Gettysburg. The key here is Fort Sumter, or the battle that never was. The book goes on to, at one point, to discuss the history of the Confederacy and the interrelationship with the United States. And by and large, it is a fairly friendly relationship. There are problems. The most serious problem is that the Confederacy has no outlet to the Pacific. They desperately want a canal somewhere near San Diego, which will link Confederate Arizona with the Pacific. And they keep agitating for that. Even the friendly governments agitate for that. Then in the mid-1950s, a new, very nationalistic party emerges called the Party of National Resurgence. This is in the Confederacy. And this is where this character, Howie Ray Spearman, emerges. And Howie Ray Spearman and the Party of National Resurgence create a totalitarian state in the South. There's always an emphasis in the book that the Southerners themselves are lovely people. We have no complaint with them. If only we could get rid of that damn Spearman. Now, Spearman is an interesting guy. He's a kind of amalgam of several historic and even literary characters. He only appears on rare occasions when he speaks to the multitudes. And he's a very fascinating-looking man. He's quite elderly. I've no idea what age he would be, but he's got snow-white hair, masses of it, great leonine masses on his head, and piercing eyes. Physically, his facial and the hair and face and the eyes and so forth, he sounds like John C. Calhoun, though I wouldn't carry the comparison any further than that. He is a fascinating orator. He is able to cast a spell over people when he speaks. He almost has Hitler's ability to do that. He keeps himself out of sight and is almost a sort of mythical figure. To that extent, he's a little bit like Big Brother in 1984. There's, I think, also a dash of Huey Long in Howie Ray Spearman. So he's a sort of amalgam of several characters. And his long-range goal is to break the deadlock between the Confederacy and the United States and have the Confederacy emerge as the greatest power. And what has happened is that in 1981, an international treaty was going to be signed banning nuclear weapons, all nuclear weapons. And Howie Ray was going to wait until the United States had put its nuclear weapons down, and then he was going to launch a preemptive strike. And then he was going to invade, and he was going to take over the country. I mean, it's a nasty piece of work. There's no question about it. The solution is to assassinate him, because the feeling is that there's nobody else in the hierarchy who would really do this or could carry this off. And so this Cordell Vance is brought on board. Now, there's a whole sort of story about that. Cordell Vance's background, his training, he's a bit of a loose cannon, but he is a former Southerner. His father was a civil rights worker in the South in the 1950s, and he was sent north at that time because his father was afraid that he himself might be harmed, and he wanted his son out of harm's way. So Cordell is raised in the North, but he is originally a Southerner by birth. And there are a number of sort of complications brought into it. In the final analysis, he is successful in assassinating Howie Ray Spearman. How he does it is that the United States has an agent in place in the Confederate capital, which is Confederate City. And Confederate City is located roughly where Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia come together. A federal district was created there west of Chattanooga. And this agent had a camera shop, and as luck would have it, Vance knew a lot about cameras. So they simply moved him in and the other agent out and managed to physically make him over to look like this guy. Takes a bit of doing. Anyway, he just simply moves in, and he has the status and identity of this man. Now, this is a totalitarian society, so there's the Citizens Protective Force that goes around and beats up people that they don't like. There's police checks all over the place. Slavery's been abolished, again, shortly after 1861, I think again in the 1870s. But black Confederates are kept segregated in their own basically decent living areas and segregated schools, but everything else is open. I mean, there's no segregated parks or theaters or anything like that. And most blacks and most whites think Mr. Howie is just, the beginning and the end. I mean, they absolutely worship the man, which I would have thought would make his assassination rather a casus belli, but apparently not. Anyway, he is successful. He manages to get close enough to Howie Ray Spearman to shoot a couple of steel splinters into the back of Howie Ray's skull, which certainly does him, but I simplify the process enormously. There was also a mortar attack conducted by Cordell's father, and on it goes. It's what I would call a rollicking good tale. You don't really have to be a Civil War buff to appreciate this. It's a sort of poor man's Frederick Forsyth. You know, it's not as good as Frederick Forsyth, but it's a good story. It's a good story. And in the final analysis, Cordell, who is now called Peter Tremont because he's taken on another identity, continues living in Confederate City, marries his fiancée, and goes happily into the sunset. And Howie Ray, of course, has disappeared from the scene, and a more benign leader has emerged, and war is averted, and all is fine. And there are sort of suggestions that perhaps reunion will be effective now that Howie Ray has been removed. Which brings us, I think, arguably to the best. Grey victory. Again, the teaser. What if the South had won the Civil War? What if Richmond, Virginia became a bustling, wealthy world capital, a center for international affairs? What if a dashing Confederate hero, General Jeb Stuart, was put on trial for blunders at Gettysburg he didn't commit? Now it's 1866. The Confederate States are gripped by courtroom drama, the colorful escapades of beautiful Southern belles and fiery preachers, and the schemes of spies and revolutionaries. A dedicated band of Northern abolitionists hatch a daring plot to violently advance their cause, and while politicians try to make Jeb Stuart their scapegoat, the outcome of the trial turns on the most stirring moments of a war the South won. This one has the advantage, at least it's fairly close in time to the event. Now, how did the South win in this instance? Very interesting. You might guess a long time before you got this. It's not as obvious as Gettysburg or even Fort Sumter. The Georgia Campaign, 1864, summer of 1864. Joseph Johnston retreating from the Chattanooga area towards Atlanta, fighting a brilliant Fabian campaign against the overwhelming numbers of William Tecumseh Sherman. You know the history of that, I'm sure, very well. Johnston would take up a position. Sherman had the choice of either attacking it frontally, as he did at Kennesaw Mountain, or going around the flanks, as he did most of the time. When he went around the flanks, Johnston would retreat again. All was getting closer to Atlanta, but keeping his army intact and inflicting some damage on the enemy when he chose to attack. Eventually, President Davis got a bit tired of these tactics. He wanted a fighter, so in mid-July, Johnston was sacked to be replaced by the fiery John Bell Hood. And Hood, as you know, committed the Army of Tennessee to 3 major battles between July 20th and July 28th, got mauled in all 3 of them, and finally took his battered army into siege positions at Atlanta, held out for a month, and finally on the 2nd of September was forced to surrender Atlanta. That's what more or less what really happened. In this book, Johnston is never relieved from command. Davis is very torn. He thinks long and hard about it. You can almost see the perspiration running down his face. In Richmond in July, that's not too difficult to imagine. And as he, puzzles over this, what to do. And finally he comes to the conclusion, Johnston must go. We've had enough of this retreating. But then he thinks about it a little more, and he thinks, no, we'll give him, he's done well to keep the army together. We'll keep him in command. We'll see what happens. So what happens? Johnston retreats into the defenses of Atlanta with his army basically intact, having fought this series of defensive actions all the way down from northern Georgia. But the army is basically intact, so he has considerably more men than Hood had in real life. September 2nd comes and goes. Atlanta holds out. Into October, Atlanta holds out. Early November, and Lincoln is, of course, running for re-election. Atlanta is still holding out. And indeed, remember, in Virginia, Petersburg is still holding out. The northern electorate have decided they've had enough of it. They've had enough of the blood and the sacrifice. George B. McClellan, the Democratic candidate of our boys, and he arranges for a ceasefire to take place at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Golly, I should remember the date now, but it's in mid-November of 1864. The war comes to an end. The Confederacy has won. The plot of the book that develops after that is again a rollicking good story, though a different rollicking good story than this one. What happens is that Edward Pollard, a name I'm sure familiar to you, the editor of the Richmond Examiner, publishes a story on the 1st of July, I think it's the 1st of July, 1866, attacking Jeb Stuart for his disgraceful behavior in the Gettysburg campaign. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. You know, Jeb Stuart's somewhat irregular progress on the flank of the Union Army and so forth, and it's always been controversial. Pollard attacks him directly for this. He says, in effect, this is why we lost at Gettysburg, because Stuart deprived Lee of the eyes and ears of his army and so forth and so on. There's a tremendous uproar. And the man in the center is, of course, Jeb Stuart, who, you might be surprised, is still alive. I know he is supposed to have been killed at Yellow Tavern. What happened at Yellow Tavern in this context is he was seriously wounded. He was shot in the side by a Michigan cavalry trooper and badly wounded, but he did not die. And he survived, and in 1866 he's still alive and still as grandiloquent as ever. And of course he's furious. He wants to horsewhip Pollard and so forth and so on. His friend John Mosby, another familiar name, restrains him and says, "Now, Jeb, just don't pay any attention, and we all know what kind of person Pollard is, and just blow over." Unfortunately, it doesn't. The president, still Mr. Davis, decides there should be a court of inquiry into Jeb's conduct during the Gettysburg campaign. And the court of inquiry is to be presided over by that friendly old North Carolinian Braxton Bragg. Wouldn't you love to have him preside over your court of inquiry? The two other officers will be John Bell Hood and George Pickett. It looks like a stacked deck, certainly to Jeb Stuart and to Mosby, who agrees to serve as his legal counsel. Now, one of the themes of the book is the ongoing drama of that court of inquiry and the conflict that develops between the various people involved in this. The three, well, not so much Hood and Pickett don't say much, but Bragg is, as you might imagine, rather front and center. Various witnesses, the most important of which, of course, is old Pete, James Longstreet, who is vowed and determined that Stuart's hide is going to be nailed to the wall. Stuart was the man responsible for the defeat at Gettysburg. He makes no bones about that. And so a good deal of the action involves Mosby trying to find people who will contradict witnesses that claim that, Stuart was a drag on the army and so forth and so on. At one point, Mosby even went up to Arlington, to the Lee estate, and tried to persuade Lee himself to come down and testify. The old man wouldn't do it. He said, no, this really has nothing to do with me, and I promised President Davis I wouldn't, and so forth and so on. So that turns out to be a bit of a false trail. They locate a spy, a scout. You may recall the name of the scout Harrison, who shows up in the Gettysburg campaign, the Confederate scout. He's quite prominent in the Killer Angels. They find Harrison, and they hope, Mosby hopes that he will be a prime witness. Harrison turns out to be a drunk and really quite irresponsible, and he has to assign one of his staff just to make sure that he shows up in court sober and this kind of thing. And the guy comes in and his eyes are down to here. He looks terrible, and he's not a very reliable or reputable witness. In the meantime, you get to see a little bit inside the minds of the court itself. Bragg is Bragg. I mean, he was not involved at Gettysburg, but he intrinsically doesn't like Stuart. I mean, you can imagine they're very different types. Pickett is very much in Longstreet's corner. He's Longstreet's boy, and always very fond of Longstreet, and always felt that Lee blamed Longstreet for the defeat at Gettysburg and so forth. This is in real life as well as in the book. So in a sense, a lot of pressure is put on Hood, and Hood comes across as a fairly sympathetic character in this. He's a very lonely man. And remember, he was the man who was in charge of the extreme right wing of the Confederate attack on the 2nd of July, the attack that tried to take the Little Round Top. So he was there, and he knows what happened. Anyway, the drama finally centers on Lee making the decision that he will testify. He will come down from Arlington, and he will testify, because he feels he has to set the record straight. And in effect, what he does is to say that his original orders, Lee's original orders to attack on the second day, to attack the Union left wing, were wrong. That what they should have done was gone around the Little Round Top and come in behind. He said, if we'd done that, we'd have won. And he said, if I had known that that was the disposition of the enemy, then I would have done that. And he said, I don't want to blame Longstreet, but I do. But he should have told me, he should have come back to me and told me that this was the enemy's disposition. If I'd done that, then we would have done things quite differently. We would have moved our own troops quite differently. And at one point, he points to Hood and he says, Sam, you can agree with that, can't you? And Hood just nods his head. He said, yes, that's what should have been done. He said, our attack was a disaster if we'd moved differently. He said, it had nothing to do with Jeb. It wasn't Jeb's fault. So, in essence, it would appear Jeb is exonerated. However, there's a reference there to abolitionists. I don't want to go into great detail on this, but there was a radical group of abolitionists who had infiltrated Richmond, who were going to storm the court on the final day and kill as many prominent Confederates as they could, because they wanted to restart the war. This was the only way that the slaves were going to be released, you see, that the slaves were going to be freed. And they are headed by Salmon Brown, one of John Brown's youngsters, who was not at Harper's Ferry. And he's a real nut, is Brown. I mean, a very interesting psychiatric case. And their group is they call themselves Amistad, after a famous slave ship, Spanish slave ship incident in, I think, the early 1840s. And they are loosely allied, very loosely allied, to a black group in Richmond and the rest of the Confederacy, which calls itself Abraham. Now, Abraham is headed by a black preacher, former soldier from in the Union Army, named Jubilo. And Jubilo is himself a bit of a Fabian. His organization is working towards the freedom of his people. But he is very much, again, any premature move that is simply going to make things worse. And he regards this Amistad group as just completely off the wall. They'll just simply make things a great deal worse. He remembers things like the Nat Turner revolt and so forth, and the reaction of Southern society to that. So he counsels vigorously against this, but to no avail. In the final analysis, the Amistad plot is defeated, but not before the attack is actually launched in the courtroom. And Judah Benjamin, the famous Judah Benjamin, who held several portfolios under the Confederacy, is stabbed to death by a member of Amistad who had actually been his mistress. And Jeb Stuart is shot because as Salmon Brown charges forward with the pistol, Stuart steps in front of him, and the bullet intended for Robert E. Lee hits Stuart and kills him. So Stuart dies in a Richmond courthouse in 1866, not at Yellow Tavern in 1864. And that's how the story ends, with blood all over the courtroom and all the conspirators dead. But the Abraham group, because they had not committed themselves, are still in existence, and you are led to believe that this will eventually lead to the abolition of slavery and so forth. Ultimately, a happy end down the path. This book, I think, is the most fun for those of you who are interested in the Civil War, because virtually all of the major characters in it are or were real people, real characters. I haven't named all of them. There was a General John Rawlins who was in the Grant cabinet and who had been one of Grant's officers during the war, who acts as a kind of Union liaison with the Confederate government during this period, because McClellan does not want these crazy abolitionists starting another war any more than most other people do. There are a number of very intriguing female characters who I must say are far more attractive than the female characters in Bring the Jubilee, a bit more traditional perhaps. So it involves really more of the dynamic of the Civil War in this book. And the phrase "gray victory," it's rather interesting because at the end, one of the characters, and I think it might be General Rawlins, says, if the abolitionists had their way, they would stir the teeming masses of the North to reinvade the South once again, and then they would realize what a gray victory they had achieved. So it puts a whole sort of new slant on the term gray victory. In other words, not a total victory at all. Lots of food for thought in there. Those are the three I wanted to consider. Tom brought up If the South Had Won the Civil War by McKinley Cantor, where the crucial event is Vicksburg. Grant falls off his horse and is killed at Vicksburg, and General John C. McClernand, remember him? Clearly on everyone's short list as one of the worst Union generals in the Civil War, takes command of the Union forces, and of course Vicksburg is a disaster, and the South wins there. Then there's also, thanks to Tom, Harry Turtledove's The Guns of the South, in which, in the spring of 1864, Lee's army is equipped with AK-47s. And when Tom and I were discussing this talk, I said, I don't think I even want to touch that. So I've touched it, but I'm not going to go beyond that. Thanks very much. I've run on a little bit, I'm sorry.
That's okay. At the risk of keeping you any longer, though, are there any questions or comments? This has certainly been rollicking good fun.
Rollicking, I'm glad to hear that.
There may be some.
Could you give the names of the authors of the three books?
Yes, they're names that probably are not household names to you. Ward Moore is the author of Bring the Jubilee. Now, this was published in 1953. Ward Moore was born in 1906 and probably is not with us anymore. You might be able to perhaps find this in hardcover somewhere. It's a very, in some ways, a tough novel to read. It's short. It's only 190 pages. But it's very Dickensian. Most of the characters in this book would have been very much at home in a Dickens novel. This is Robert Stapp, S-T-A-P-P, A More Perfect Union. You'll recognize the phrase, of course, from the preamble to the Constitution. It's more in the sort of thriller category, really. As I say, even if you didn't know anything about the Civil War, you could probably read that and get a kick out of it. This, I would say, is perhaps the best book for the Civil War buff, Grey Victory by Robert Skimmon. I don't know if it's still in print. It came out originally in 1989. It might well still be in print, though I must confess I haven't seen it lately. Skimmon, S-K-I-M-I-N.
There'll be a run at the used bookstores this weekend, I think.
Well, you might. This one, well, you'd probably have the best chance of finding. These others, I don't know, but this one should still be around. But this is probably the best anyway, because you'll find, as a Civil War buff, when you're reading this, you know, there are references to various events, battles, political leaders, generals, whatever it might be, and you'll find yourself saying, "Oh yeah, of course, I remember him," or "Oh yes, I know who that is," and so forth and so on. I think the main sort of twist that they've done here is to resurrect Jeb Stuart and have him killed, in effect, 2 years and 2 months after he originally died.
Another question, down here.
What was the name of the first book by Ward Moore?
Bring the Jubilee. Bring the Jubilee. I suppose from the old song, hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee, marching through Georgia.
I'd like to point out that if you're not really a hardcore Civil War buff, Guns in the South is actually a very good, well-written book. It's really much fantasy, but if you want a good laugh.
Yeah. I think that's a fair description. Yeah, that's a fair description. I think the trouble is, for many of us who I suppose we are Civil War buffs, or many of us are, the idea of Lee's army with AK-47s boggles the imagination, you know?
But
I mean,
the basis of it are South African white separatists who come back in a time machine. So it brings in the physics fantasy.
The physics
of
fantasy.
Bring the Jubilee.
Right, that's true.
I'm curious where your interest is kindled in the Civil War. I mean, you're obviously Canadian.
I'm Canadian, that's correct. Well, when I was in high school, I read The Red Badge of Courage. Now, I suppose most of you have read The Red Badge of Courage. It's kind of a strange book, isn't it? I mean, it's filled with symbolism and so forth. But it captured my attention. And I thought, this is interesting now. I should like to know more about this. I was about 15 years old at the time. That year, we had to give public speeches in English class. So I thought, all right, I'll talk about the American Civil War. So I did a little research and found out, when Chancellorsville was in relation to Chattanooga and so forth. And I ran through the Civil War for my high school class, and I got 97% on the speech. So I thought that was pretty good. Mind you, I realized after I'd done it that I'd left out Antietam, but nobody noticed.
That's the advantage about knowing something that other people don't know.
Even the teacher didn't pick me up on it, you see. And anyway, that kind of got me going, and I began reading and collecting, and when I was in university, I started making my first rather tentative forays into the South, and one of my fondest memories is seeing the Confederate White House in 1955, before it was all spiffed up and modernized the way it is today. In those days, it was run by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and each room was for a separate state, And it was more a sort of, I suppose, an exercise in antiquarianism than anything else, but it had a certain charm to it. And indeed, Richmond in those days, I thought, had a certain charm because it hadn't changed that dramatically in the 100 years since the Civil War. There were no skyscrapers. There was no, great development and so forth. Everything, a little bit like Charleston in that respect, where there are no skyscrapers either. And when I was back in Richmond a few years ago, of course, my God, I could, the White House is still there, but how it has changed,
It's surrounded now.
It's surrounded, yes. And, my guide in 1955 was a little old lady with the sweetest Virginia accent you could ever possibly imagine, I remember we were talking about Thaddeus Stevens, who, as you might imagine, was not a favorite topic of hers. And she said, I guess that Thaddeus Stevens was just about the worst man in all of American history. I can't really imitate her accent because I said that way too fast. Way too fast. But she was just lovely, She was just so charming, and I could have talked for hours to her, and indeed I did. I spent a lot of time there. And then when I was back there a few years ago, I was taken through the Confederate White House, which had all been done over, and period furniture and wallpaper and rugs and so forth. Some of that furniture, the genuine article from the Davis days, others just simply period furniture, but it looked much as it might have when Jeff and Verena Davis lived there. And the young man who took us around had no accent, had no discernible accent at all, very what I would call neutral accent. Certainly there wasn't a hint of Virginia in it. And indeed, I found on that trip that most of the people I talked to in Virginia did not have much of a Virginia accent.
And you have to go out to Farmville.
Well, I got lost near Charlottesville. That's where I made my one discovery.
Neil, did you have a question?
The last time I was down south, and you ask anyone about the Civil War, they always, you Yankees won due to either repeating rifles, mini balls, or industrial might. And this was all they ever say. Do you have any opinion on
why the North won?
Why the North won?
Oh, God.
I mean,
we'll be serving breakfast.
condensed version.
Well, golly. I'll tell you, a book I always liked on that was David Donald's little book that he edited called Why the North Won the Civil War, which doesn't give you all the answers, but it does give you 5 different categories. Political, economic, military, social, and diplomatic. And it goes a long way to answering your question. I guess the Reader's Digest condensed version of an answer to your question would be there were a great many factors. Certainly not only did the Union have a larger population, 23 million people at the beginning of the war compared to 9 million in the South, 4 million of whom were slaves. That in itself might be offered as, as explanation. But as you're well aware, during the war, large numbers of immigrants were pouring in to northern ports, and many of them found themselves in blue uniforms before they'd really gotten themselves turned around, recruiting sergeants, German-speaking recruiting sergeants, Italian-speaking recruiting sergeants, Irish-speaking recruiting sergeants would be at docks to meet them, and so there was, in a sense, although people criticize Grant for what he did, it does make, in terms of attrition, it does make sense, because he could replace the men he lost. Lee and the other Confederates simply could not. However, pure numbers alone doesn't explain it. I think it is a major factor. I've always been rather entranced, though, with the thesis that a major problem for the Confederacy was their difficulty in, despite what you hear now and sort of response that you get from people down there, how divided they were. If they had managed really to have a united front, and if there hadn't been people like Zebulon Vance in North Carolina and Joe Brown in Georgia, state-minded governors, if you'd had more of a real commitment, they might. I think they did very well anyway. But they might very well have done better. Essentially, the Confederacy didn't have to win, did they? They only needed a draw. All they had to do was tire the Union out, and if they could make the cost of victory too high, perhaps the Union would get tired and say to hell with it and throw in the sponge. That's what Britain did after Yorktown. The British could have continued the Revolutionary War, but they simply lost the will to do it, and it was becoming too expensive and so forth. So they simply threw in the sponge. The Union never threw in the sponge. And perhaps Northern nationalism, Northern patriotism, in a sense, was a more solid commodity than was Southern nationalism, which tended to be fairly particularized, didn't it? It tended to be centered on the state and centered on one's home community and so forth. And you have so many examples, particularly towards the end of the war, of Confederate soldiers just deserting because they no longer felt this was their war. They'd had letters from home complaining about, that the crops were dying and the children were starving and so forth and so on. And they said to hell with it and they left, So there was, I think, a number of social and political divisions within the Confederacy. But it's a huge subject. It's a huge subject. If Britain had recognized Confederate independence, particularly if Britain had been prepared to intervene. After all, the American colonies got the intervention of practically all of Europe, didn't they? Well, France, Spain, and Holland, and the benevolent neutrality of the rest of Europe. The Confederacy never had that. And that was, an enormous factor. So on and on it goes. I don't know that it's enough to say, you had more mini balls and therefore you won. It's a factor, but there's more to it.
One more. If you continue along those lines a little bit and consider that perhaps Lincoln had lost the election in November of '64, and take into account all the political and social and economic problems in the South, do you think they could have endured as a nation and been successful that way?
I kind of question that. Whether they actually could have. This is why I have trouble with Ward Moore's thesis of the Confederacy as great power, emerging after the war. Even Skimmon suggests that, the Confederacy was a substantial nation. Let's face it, by the end of 1864, much of the country was in ruins. Tom mentioned my talk on the Red River Valley. I mean, the Red River Valley was absolutely devastated by that campaign. You know what happened in the Shenandoah. You know what happened in Georgia. And that happened in other parts of the South that we don't perhaps hear quite so much about, you know. I mean, Grant did all kinds of terrible things around Vicksburg, eh? And there's one town in that area, I forget the name of it now, though I've been there. And they said
Sherman practiced on Meridian before
Meridian,
the
yeah,
Meridian
yeah.
campaign before he went to Georgia.
That's right, that's right. But there's one little town there that says, you know, welcome to such and such. The town Sherman thought was too pretty to burn. And it's a very pretty little town. I wish I could remember the name of it. It's near Vicksburg. But there was a lot of that, you know, a lot of that. And certainly there were serious divisions. As you're, I'm sure, well aware, even before the war, there was a serious social division between the mountain people, living in the interior, and the so-called tidewater folk along the coast. That runs right through American history, of course, right back to colonial days. The Civil War in the Appalachian Mountains is a story unto itself. I mean, that was really, that had its own dynamic and was very, very personal, highly personal, and there were lots of atrocities on both sides. And so, yeah, there were a great many problems. I think if the South were going to emerge triumphant, they were going to need vast amounts of capital. And I'm not sure if, and the British would be the obvious choice, I'm not sure if the British would have been prepared necessarily to do that, because they would have been looking for a return on their investment, and I'm not sure how good an investment the South would have been, even if it had emerged triumphant. Therefore, I tend to feel that even if they had won, there would have been some sort of reunion at some point. Does McKinley Cantor posit the Spanish-American War as the point of return?
I think he brings that as a reunion point, whether they come back together or just have a joint operating.
Joint operation,
I haven't read that in some time. But
yeah, it's been a long time since I've read that.
Right.
But,
yeah, we'll take another one or
One
two.
quick question. You went to school in Canada, you're Canadian.
yes.
What was Canada's, did they study the Civil War, that being American history, did they study the Civil War very much at all, or did you stumble onto this on your own?
I pretty much stumbled onto it on my own. If I'd relied on what I learned in school, I don't think I'd be here, to be quite honest. Okay? I did a survey course in American history in university, which kind of touched on the Civil War, right? What were the causes of the Civil War? Well, it was slavery, and but maybe something to do with economics. But that was about it. I guess it would be fair to say, and I don't mean this in a nasty fashion, we probably do more American history in our universities than you do Canadian history in yours. You probably wouldn't argue with that. We do some American history, but I don't know. I don't think that's true, because when I look at programs over here in various schools that I've been to and so on, I'm always quite impressed, not only with the range, but with the depth and the variety that you get into in the history of your own country. And we're starting to do that. But our problem, of course, and you can relate to this, is that we're facing cutbacks. I teach, as I was telling Tom, I taught 300 students this past semester. I'm not being replaced. So, who teaches those 300 students next year, right? Some of my colleagues. And there's obviously going to be a loss of something there, isn't there? You can't, you can only force so much after a while. I think, if I can make a broad statement, I think our teaching of American history in Canadian universities is adequate, but not sensational. I would suggest that a Canadian student who really is interested in American history and who wanted to do postgraduate degree would most likely come down here. Not necessarily, but most likely come down here. I considered it at one point, but I got channeled off into something else. My major research area is Canadian-American relations. It's not the Civil War. But I've taught a course on the Civil War at Windsor, and I've been reading about it for 40 some odd years.
And touring.
And touring and wandering, yes, and going to museums and talking to old ladies and having a grand time.
Well,
having a grand time.
Let me invite anybody who would like to come up for a moment afterwards and chat to do so. I just want to take a different turn on that comment about you not being replaced. It may be that you're irreplaceable, and that's the way you should look at it.
Well, that's kind of you, Tom. That's a nice way of looking at it.
Now, as usual, we don't pay our speakers to come. They come because they enjoy the subject matter and the give and take. But we would like you to have a little visit at a Barnes and Noble at our expense.
Oh,
and
wonderful!
To find something that you might be able to take with you in retirement.
Yes, well, I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the States this summer.
There you
I'm
go.
sure to come across a
They've
Barnes
got a lot
and
of
Noble.
outlets. Thank you again for coming and for finishing up our year for us.
Thank you. That's very nice.
Well, it's something that we want to do with the people who come a little farther for us.
Sure. No, I think that's wonderful.